É Tudo Verdade 2021, 26º Festival Internacional de Documentários. Os melhores documentários do Brasil e do mundo em mostras competitivas e programas especiais. Gratuito e online para todo o país. De 8 a 18 de abril. Confira a programação em www.etudoverdade.com.br.
Bem-vindos à quarta e última mesa da 18ª Conferência Internacional do Documentário, uma correalização do É Tudo Verdade e do Itaú Cultural. Devido à pandemia da Covid-19, pelo segundo ano consecutivo, esse simpósio está sendo gravado e transmitido online. O tema desse ano é o centenário de nascimento do cineasta francês Chris Marker. Para essa mesa de encerramento, é uma enorme honra recebermos de volta à conferência, ainda que virtualmente, o acadêmico americano Bill Nichols. Bill já participou da conferência em várias das suas edições anteriores e honrou a Tudo Verdade participando também de um de seus júris internacionais. Ele é um dos autores fundamentais no desenvolvimento do campo dos estudos do documentário no último meio século, em títulos clássicos como Representing Reality e Introdução ao Documentário, que ganhou traduções pelo mundo inteiro, inclusive aqui no Brasil. Para essa palestra de encerramento, o Nichols propôs um recorte muito particular na obra de Chris Marker. Ele vai examiná-la em um período específico no começo dos anos 80, ainda mais específico, em um ano específico, 1962, quando Marker vai realizar dois de seus filmes mais importantes e mais influentes e muito distintos. Eu estou falando, claro, do curta-metragem de ficção científica La Jetée e, em parceria com Pierre Domme, um dos filmes pioneiros do chamado cinema direto na França, o Le Joli, o Maio Feliz, que a gente teve o privilégio de lançar em sua cópia restaurada há menos de 5 anos no É Tudo Verdade. Eu aproveito a oportunidade para agradecer ao Itaú Cultural, a seu diretor, Eduardo Saron, e a toda a equipe, a parceria em mais essa edição da conferência. Queria agradecer à produtora da conferência, Tatiana Natsu, e ao seu coordenador técnico, João Paulo de Melo Cruz. Agradecer a atenção de vocês durante todos esses dias e encerrar agradecendo demais a Bill Nichols, esperando ter o privilégio de abraçá-lo presencialmente, quem sabe já na próxima conferência, na 19ª conferência em 2022. Muito obrigado a vocês todos pela atenção e boa palestra.
Well, greetings from San Francisco. I'm here on a rainy day in our city, and I'm delighted to be there in Sao Paulo in your city. I want to thank Tatiana, Daniela, and especially Amir and everyone else that's put this all together for inviting me. And I'm going to be talking about two of Chris Marker's early films, Le Joli and Le Jetée. They were both made at the same time. While he was shooting the longer Joli, he also shot the photographs that make up Le Jetée. So they follow also, and you'll see a dialogue as I go on with the talk, Jean Rouch and Edgar Morin's Chronique d'un été, which was shot in 1960 and came out in 61. And then Marker shot his films in 62. So the two films and the two filmmakers are really in a dialogue. They're both ask questions about whether Parisians are happy. Both talk about issues that are timely to that moment in France and timeless in terms of common human condition issues we all confront. So I wanted to back up a little and give you a sense of what the events in France 1960 were, because they may not be entirely familiar. They weren't to me, I have a vague idea, general idea of what they were, but I wanted to give you a better sense of them because Le Joli in particular really addresses Paris in 1962. Charles de Gaulle was a leader of Free France during World War II in opposition to the collaborationist Vichy government, which collaborated with the Nazis. And de Gaulle oversaw the immediate post-war recovery, but then stepped away from politics in 1946. He returned to power in 1958. Why? Because the Fourth Republic, which was what France had in the post-war period, was floundering. It had proven very inefficient. Problems were increasing. There was no clear leader. The legislature was trying to do things with committees and so on. And they had an increasingly unpopular war in Algeria. It was a war against a fierce independent movement led by the FLN, the National Liberation Front, and which is the one we see in Battle of Algiers, made in 1966. De Gaulle, when he returned in 1958, instituted the Fifth Republic. It changed the constitution for France, and it allowed for a single powerful leader, the president, which happened to be Charles de Gaulle. He himself was a very complicated mix, and he brought about the kind of conditions that we see discussed in Le Joli. He was a nationalist, but he was against the colonial legacy, particularly in light of the wave of post-war liberation in Africa, where many countries like Kenya and many others gained their independence. He was also against US hegemony. He wanted France to be autonomous and independent player on the world stage, not beholden to the United States or the Soviet Union, although it was plagued by this war in Algeria. But he was also strongly anti-communist. He oversaw an economy that was both struggling, which we see demonstrated in Chronique d'un été by Angelo, who works and struggles at the Renault car factory, and in Le Joli by a large group of railroad workers who are on strike for basically to gain a living wage. It was also in this period in the early 60s that consumerism and all of the gadgets and appliances that were so popular in the post-war was surging into France for some. There was also, by the time Marquer was making his film, the French had discovered that their tradition of égalité, liberté, and fraternité had been systematically undermined in the Algerian War by continuous, hideous forms of torture against the Algerians, much like the Nazis had done in World War II to the French and resistance and to others in every other country they controlled. It was a blow to the self-image to learn that torture was common practice, as we see in the Battle of Algiers. And de Gaulle decided to coup d'etat in 1960, where parts of the military that were still supporting the colony and wanted to overthrow the Fifth Republic, and an attempted assassination of de Gaulle himself in 1961, which is the subject matter of The Day of the Jackal, a film made later, and the anger of the traditional army elements and the Pieds Noirs, the European citizens, many of them French, who had immigrated to Algeria to build their lives there, assuming they would forever be part of the French Commonwealth as a colony. Despite all that, de Gaulle decided Algeria needed to be independent. And that effort really took shape in 1962 after Chronique d'un été, but during Le Joli. He set up a negotiation with the FLN that led to the Evian Accord in March of 1962, which basically set the terms and conditions for Algerian independence. There was a vote in April confirming the Evian Accord. French people agreed this is what we need. And in May, the same May of Le Joli Mai, there was an official ceasefire ending the war. So when Macaire was filming, the war that had gone on for 9 years had just that moment ended. But it left much to be resolved. So it was, in essence, a turbulent time. There was intense debate about the war. There was concern about the changes, transformations in post-war Paris, where slums were wiped out and new, pretty much ugly project housing put in its place, large slabs of apartment buildings. There was worry about the bomb in all of this Cold War period, and concern about whether a single powerful leader was a good idea. So what was happening in French film? Again, we're going to back into the films we're talking about more specifically to just indicate how all those filmmakers we know as the makers of the new wave at the very end of the 50s and beginning of the 60s were already active during this period of de Gaulle's Fifth Republic and before. Godard, Truffaut, Rivette, Chabrol had all been making films along with Varda, René, Rouche, and Macaire through the 50s. Godard started in 55 and made several short fiction and documentary films before Breathless in 60. Truffaut made short fictions and collaborated on a documentary with Godard beginning in 55 before making 400 Blows in 59. Rivette made several short fictions before making his first feature, Paris nous appartient, which was Paris Belongs to Us in 61, which was actually shot in 57, but not out till later, and therefore the very first of the New Wave films. Chabrol went directly to feature filmmaking because of a family inheritance with The Beau Serge in 58. Varda, Agnes Varda, who is close to Macaire and Rouche in many ways, began making short fictions and documentaries and films that combined the two since 55, before making Cleo 5 to 7 her first feature in 62. Alain René worked with Macaire as co-directors on Les Statues Meurent aussi. The Statues Also Die, about African art. In 53, he made his very famous Night and Fog in 55, before making Hiroshima Mon Amour in 59. Jean Rouche began making films in 47, ethnographic films about tribal culture and rituals, and eventually role-playing, which becomes a very big part of what I'll be talking about. Back in 47, but he made Les Maîtres Fous in 55, Moi, un Noir in 57, and then Chronique d'un été, shot in 60, released in 61. Okay, so one of the things Rouche's films that Macaire would have known well, like Moi, un Noir, Jaguar, and Chronique d'un été, what those films raised and what the new technology that allowed cinema verite to arrive in the early 60s, late 50s, was new questions about role-playing and the presentation of self. How do we present ourselves in everyday life and in front of a camera? The new technology, which I won't go into, but you're probably quite familiar with, meant that these filmmakers, Rouche, Macaire, and all the others by the time of the New Wave, had handheld cameras and, extremely importantly, synchronous sound, thanks to the Nagra, which allowed them to record speech, everyday life, on location, in sync, in the moment. So the very moment of filming became a central aspect through interviews, through observation. It captured life as it is lived and life as it is confronted by a camera in a new, vivid way. And what I want to suggest, thanks largely to the work of Tom Waugh, is that this not only was two different approaches for the filmmaker in terms of observation or interaction using this new equipment, it also revealed two different ways of self-presentation for the subjects, for social actors. On the one hand, there's the self that goes about its business as it would if the camera were not there. This is where we maintain the fourth wall. And beyond the fourth wall, the camera looks in at what people are doing, observational, very more popular in North America. And I'm going to call that form of performance mimetic performance. It's how we perform ourselves every day to present ourselves to others. And it's mimetic in the sense that we're constantly imitating or repeating ourselves to create a sense for ourselves and others of a stable identity with many facets to it. It was not till 1990, but Judith Butler in her book, Gender Trouble, argued that this form of self-presentation includes our sense of gender, of ourself as male, female, masculine, feminine, that which we might think of as genetic and given from the beginning is actually something that we are affirming and reaffirming day after day in how we present ourselves. And if we fail to present a continuous, stable self, problems or changes take place. So that's the sense of a vécu, of life as it's lived and experienced by the individual is now available to this handheld sync sound cinema. The other alternative, which is the interactive one, is where there is no fourth wall. Now the filmmaker and the subject are on the same plane. And this is where the subject of the film breaks through the wall and addresses, and the filmmaker likewise, to address each other directly. Typically in interviews, but it could be conversation, provocations, all kinds of ways the filmmaker and the subject can participate in the moment as if the camera is only facilitating or complicating their interaction. Now, the self that presents itself in that situation is what I'm calling the reflective self, as opposed to the mimetic self. It's the self stepping back to talk about the self that would otherwise go about its business with no camera present. What do you think about what you did yesterday? Are you happy? These types of provocations or questions urge the subject to speak directly to the camera and reflect on aspects of their life that would be taking place otherwise. So it's a more meta commentary about their experience. Okay. This is something that Rouche and Morin reflect on themselves in Chronique d'un été that I think was very provoking for Marquer. And I'm going to take my camera or phone, both, on a little trip here to go to see if I can get my screening room activated, because I want to show you a clip from the end of Chronique d'un été. This is a moment when Rouche and Marquer are now talking. One moment.
Comme dans la vie de tous les jours. C'est-à-dire qu'ils ne sont pas guidés, parce que nous n'avons pas guidé, les spectateurs ne m'ont pas dit un tel est gentil, un tel est méchant, un tel est sympathique, un tel est intelligent.
That's Morin.
Et alors, devant ces gens-là qui sont des gens qui peuvent rencontrer dans la vie, ils sont désemparés, ils sentent qu'ils sont mis en cause de la vie, ils se sentent concernés et ils essaient de refuser. Oui, d'accord. Il y a d'autres gens qui sont émus par ça. Moi, ce qui m'a frappé, c'est qu'il y a des gens, par exemple, qui sont très émus par Marie-Lou, d'autres qui sont très émus par Marceline, d'autres par Jean-Pierre, d'autres par Angelo. C'est-à-dire qu'en partie, je crois que quelque chose, quand même, de ce que nous allons faire va passer. Et toi, tu es ému? Moi, bon, ça fait de nombre de fois qu'on a vu ce film.
That's Rush who asked if he was moved.
Je suis ému maintenant d'une autre façon, parce que au début, si tu veux, je croyais que tout le monde allait être ému par ce film. Et de voir maintenant que des gens que j'aime beaucoup, comme Paris ou comme Marceline, sont contestés, alors moi, ça me gêne, ça m'embête. Je croyais que les spectateurs allaient aimer les personnages que j'aime. Bon, autrement dit, nous avons dû faire un film d'amour et on aboutit à une sorte de film d'indifférence. Mais en tout cas, dans lequel, non pas d'indifférence, un film
Dans les gens réels.
de réaction, et de réaction qui n'est pas forcément une réaction sympathique. C'est la difficulté de communiquer quelque chose. Nous sommes dans le bain.
Okay. Let me put that back off. So here you see them discussing the film that they've just made. And that kind of reflexive turn is one of the qualities that I think distinguishes the film. And you also hear Marceline Loridan at the very end asking, Est-ce que vous êtes heureux? Which is the question, are you happy? That is central to the film's overall structure and becomes picked up by Chris Marker for the Joli. So Marker and Rush frame their film. They put their comments around everything that we have seen. And we'll see how Marker does something similar with Le Joli, but very differently too. Marker himself began making films in 1952. He made that film, The Statues Also Die, with Alain Resnais in 1953. He made 3 epistolary films. You'll be seeing the letter from Siberia, but also Sunday in Peking, now Beijing, and letter from Tel Aviv, as well as a film in Cuba. But those 3 were epistolary. They're in the form of letters, the trope that he picks up and uses in a much more complicated way in Sans Soleil. And then there's Le Joli, 1962. I wanted to say a little more about the central part of the talk, the idea of paradox and contradiction, which I'll come to, because it's one of the things I think is brought out by the new technology, the whole movement of cinema verite, direct cinema, observation, interaction, whatever we call it, in this period. Because the reflective self raises a basic question about who are we? Am I me all by myself, or am I the me who others recognize as me? I think there's a general consensus that the self depends on the other for its identity. Freud and Lacan make that argument in different ways, and that becomes paradoxical. How can I have an identity that I'm equal to me when it really depends on others, on you, to affirm that I am who I think I am? It's a convoluted, complicated social question. And it becomes more complicated when we speak about who we are, since we now have a self-referential meta-commentary, like Rush and Morin talking about the film, or about a subject in an interview talking about their feelings or experience, that produces a paradox. The paradox is the Cretan's paradox. If you recall, that's the one that goes, Cretans always lie. I am a Cretan. Am I lying? In this case, we're asked to accept a statement as true when its truth is asserted by the one who states it. Is I stating that inside the frame as someone who lies, Cretans, or outside the frame as someone who truthfully tells us Cretans lie? We go in a circle. Our mind goes in a circle. Cretans lie, so the speaker's lying, because he's a Cretan, or Cretans lie, so he's lying about lying. And we oscillate back and forth. How do we make sense of it? It's paradoxical. And paradox is are not resolvable in the terms they are given to us in. We're damned if we do and damned if we don't. It's called an existential paradox. So let me show you a couple of examples here. And I had to flip the phone again, so I hope this will be clear. But here's one that's not paradoxical. Can you see there's the sign here, do not read this book, and here's the book. So it's referring to something outside the frame and is perfectly logical and normal. Of course, you can't read the book, in fact, because it's not a book. That's beside the point. So that's one thing. Now, in the other case, this is a similar statement. He is telling the truth. It's referring to someone who's spoken outside the frame of this statement, and so it's perfectly logical. But this statement, I am telling the truth, brings us back to Creton's paradox. How can I validate and vouch for myself? It's circular. So do not read the book is one thing, but here is another thing. This is a message, if it's clear, that again is paradoxical. You can't do and not do what the message demands. It's self-referential in a paradoxical way. Yeah, this is I've never done this kind of zooming before, so we're experimenting on what to do. Another example of a lived existential paradox is the son sees his mother arrive. He moves to hug her. The mother pulls back. The son recoils in fear, and the mother says, "Don't be afraid of your feelings, dear. It's okay to show you love me." That's a double bind. If he shows love, he's rejected, mother pulls back. If he doesn't show love and pulls back himself, he's criticized. He's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. So my thought is that the new technology and its application in the films of this period in particular introduces this paradoxical element to the cinema. And it's particularly clear in Chronique and in La Jetée, and that Le Joli has an element of it because it's inescapable when we do interviews, but it also, I think Le Joli focuses more strongly on contradictions. So Le Joli is a film that was shot at 2.5 hours. I think it was shown in the festival a few years ago. It was originally released at a shorter version, which left out some important elements. And it begins with the question that was also at the beginning of Chronique d'un été. Are you happy? That question doesn't work well for Rouch and Morin. Marceline Loredan asked it on the street. People ignore her, they brush her off. And Rouch and Morin decide, we'll drop it. We won't interview a lot of people. We'll find a small group of people and pursue them in greater detail. Marquer, more or less in answer to the Chronique d'un été, says, wait a minute, you could do it. You can get answers from a lot of people if you ask that question the right way. And in Le Joli he succeeds. The first part of the film, which is in 2 parts, examines what people will say in 1962, which we now have some background for, about whether or not they're happy. It introduces that paradoxical element I described a moment ago about people referring to their own state like the Cretan does. And we have to decide what to make of that. This is a paradox of the person telling us they are happy or not is reporting on the state of being of the self, the I, they are reflectively representing, when we have no way to be certain that the report is true, just like the Cretan. So if we think about it, we go in a circle, but in most times we go forward, ignoring the paradox because we're interested in the content of what they say. But this is why people involved in a trial swear an oath. They swear to tell the truth. It's not a guarantee, but it encourages our willingness to trust and believe what they say. So that's a paradoxical element in Le Joli Mai, similar to the one in Chronique d'un été, made vivid by synchronous sound and interviews, and the conversations that are now a new vital aspect of documentary. And I think you get a sense of the newness in both the Chronique and in Le Joli Mai, in the sort of fresh, spontaneous, unguarded way in which people respond to a camera. Because before this, cameras in the street were unheard of. Cameras were for home movies, maybe for a few, and mostly for Hollywood sound stages and famous stars, and not something that the average person would ever see confronting them, not a movie camera. So people did not have much sense of possible consequences, unlike today. But this contradictory element is there all the same. And it arises because just as Rouge and Morin create a frame and their encounters with their subjects at the beginning and end by talking about what's happened, Marquer creates a different frame about his interviews on happiness that dominate part one of Le Joli Mai, the dreams from the Eiffel Tower, which become like a moment of fantasy compared to the reality covered in part two, subtitled The Return of Fantomas. In this regard, I could say that Le Joli Mai is an essay film about how the French of 1962 live with social contradiction, with a hint of the paradox that's more vividly on display in Chronique and in Le Jetée. And I could say that, by contrast, Chronique d'un été is an essay film about how we confront the paradoxical experience of subjects who both go about their lives and also talk about their lives to the camera, to Morin, who acts as their friend and interviewer. So part one of Le Joli Mai, subtitled Dreams from the Eiffel Tower, and the question of are you happy, given the context I've described, has a very rooted historical moment. This is the first time that France has not been at war this very month of May since World War II, even though, because of the resistance to Algerian independence by the army, by the Pied Noir, by other elements, there were bombs going off in Paris, there were massacres taking place in Algeria, there were terrorist attacks on both sides, there was a revelation about torture, there was an economy still very much out of balance, there were the massive transformations in Paris that were often degrading, and a surge for some in consumerism, all of which made it seem that happiness was something like a dream state. And we see in part one that most people duck and evade the question of happiness, and definitely duck and evade the question of the larger social context. If you say you're happy, are you really happy? Which is similar to the Cretan's paradox. Is the reflective eye who speaks for the mimetic eye of lived experience telling the truth? And I think for Marquer in part two, he tells us no, that this is not the truth. He, in fact, like the framing that the beginning and end of Chronique give, part two is a kind of framing of what interviewees say in the beginning part of Le Joli Mai. That whatever their statement about happiness is, it may be a truth, but it's not the whole truth. Social contradictions, Marquer is showing us, become displaced into personal situations heard about in the interviews that mostly deny the larger social reality. Almost no one in the film mentions, let alone explores, the Algerian War or its resolution, including the ceasefire that ended the war at the beginning of May. So I would say, though, that Marquer placed less emphasis on the existential paradox of a self-referential subject stating its truth, and more emphasis on the social contradictions that make claims of personal happiness seem like a fantasy. Fantomas, the famous underworld criminal featured in a number of films, definitely returns in part two. He returns in the form of the social contradictions Marquer makes clear through more interviews, as if to ask, how can we talk about happiness when France has lost a war to retain Algeria as a colony, even just as it lost a war to retain Indochina, when Algerian independence raises unresolved questions, with, for example, 120 bombs going off in just 1 month, when General Salan, who was the leader of the OAS, the Organisation Armée Secrète, a military group that were clandestinely attempting to terrorize the French into keeping Algeria as a colony, were carrying out bombings and assassinations and massacres, when, as we hear in part two, prisons, even a woman's prison run by nuns, was a living nightmare, when French pride in its democratic tradition is undercut by the news that France used torture systematically in Algeria, when economic inequality and ugly monolithic project housing makes Paris a far less inviting place, when railroad workers strike to earn a basic living wage, when Algerians living in France suffer from racism, from unemployment, and from physical attack, Fantomas does indeed return in many forms. These are contradictions in the social fabric that Marquer brings out in the interviews that occur in part two, and they make most sense when we see those interviews as framing what he showed us in part one. He puts it most clearly at the end of the film, when Marquer has the narrator Simone Signoret in English, Yves Montand, if we hear this voiceover narration in French. As long as prisons exist, you cannot be free. As long as despair exists, you cannot be happy. So in part one, Marquer exposes what Marx would have called false consciousness, or Althusser, an imaginary relation to the real conditions of existence. That's social contradiction. Unlike paradox, it has a solution. It's called the dialectic, in which two contradictory terms are overcome by a synthesis that resolves the contradiction. That's, in traditional terms, called revolution or synthesis. It's not what Marquer calls for. He doesn't call for revolution, even though he had Communist Party affiliation in the 60s, but it was not on the agenda. But he does show that the contradictions in French culture in the early 60s were many of the ones that erupted later in the events of May-June 1968. But all these paradoxes, and particularly the social contradictions shown by the way part two frames part one of Le Joli, might be lost on us without a good knowledge of the larger social context. The film's impact may not stand the test of time. unlike Chronique d'un été, where the paradox is more timeless, as a question of the presentation of self and how we respond to how people present themselves in the presence of a filmmaker who engages them with a camera, Marquer stresses social contradictions that occur in a specific historical moment. And that's where I think there may be, reasons for Le Joli not being a film seen as often and regarded as enduring as the other two I'm talking about. But I think with Le Jetée, Marquer does Rouge and Morin their equal. So if you see Le Jetée, well, as you see, Le Jetée is a film of great influence. The photographs that are up now, the first is from people from the future in Le Jetée, one of the photographs. The second is a group you're probably familiar with, whose image here is clearly meant to replicate the mise en scène that Marquer used in Le Jetée. Jetée is one of my favorite films, and I'm going to just stroll a little bit to get a little change of scenery since we're changing direction here in our talk. But along with Night and Fog and Les Glaneurs, for different reasons, it's a film that I just love and I've watched over and over. We could call it a ciné-roman, we could call it a documentary fiction, or we could just call it plain old science fiction. Le Jetée embodies the experience of an existential paradox much more vividly than Le Joli. We follow a series of black and white photographs. I'm going to sit over here that take us from a moment on the jetée to a bleak post-apocalyptic future, back to the past, and then forward to a future that escaped destruction. All via a journey of a man sent into the past to learn how to travel into the future to save his post-apocalyptic world, a tongue twister, but who, having done so, having brought a device from the distant future back to save the apocalyptic future, chooses to return to the past and a woman he has come to love rather than escape to the safe, distant future. But he does so only to realize that he's returned to the moment of his own death. What? This is impossible. This is like Escher's paintings or the Möbius strip where the inside becomes the outside as you follow it around. It boggles the mind. So let's see how Marquer frames this in two clips. The first clip is from the very beginning of the film. So let's see that now.
Orly, Sunday. There the parents used to take their children to watch the departing planes. Of this particular Sunday, the child whose story we are going to tell was bound to remember the sight of a frozen sun, of a stage setting at the end of the pier, and of a woman's face. Nothing tells memories from ordinary moments. Only afterwards do they claim remembrance on account of their scars. That face, which was to be a unique image of peacetime to carry with him through the whole wartime, he often wondered if he had ever seen it, or if he had dreamed a lovely moment to catch up with the crazy moment that came next, the sudden roar of the woman's gesture, the fall of a body, shrieking people. Only later did he realize that he had seen a man dying. And soon afterwards, Paris was blown up.
In this clip, a child sees a man die. And then a voiceover tells us, soon after, Paris was blown up. We then follow this man's experience as he's made a guinea pig for time travel experiments, which in their mise en scène echo the revelations of torture in Algeria and by the Nazis, but they give him extended time with the woman from the past, who he comes to love, and a successful trip to the future to save his present apocalyptic world. And it's all told in photographs that are less posed, less presentational than what we find in the interviews and other performances for and to the camera. They're not reflective photographs in that sense of him. They are more akin to mimetic performance of self, the presentation of self in the sense of the vécu, the lived experience, where the images, which are very striking in their composition, are akin to what Henri Cartier-Bresson called the decisive moment. That memory of a man who dies on the jetty at Orly is the decisive moment for the film, and one the man cannot abandon. He could go forward to a safe future, but he asked to go back to the jetée at Orly, and this is what he discovers. So now we'll look at clip 2, which comes from the end of the film.
He had been a tool in their hands. His childhood image had been used as a bait to condition him. He had lived up to their expectations. He had played his part. Now he only waited to be executed, with somewhere inside him the memory of a twice-lived fragment of time. And deep in these limbos, he got the message from the men of the world to come. They too traveled through time, and more easily. Now they were there, ready to accept him as one of their own. But he had a different request. Rather than this pacified future, he wanted the world of his childhood, and this woman who perhaps was waiting for him. Once again on the main pier at Orly, in the middle of this hot pre-war Sunday afternoon where he was now able to settle down, he thought in a confused way that the child he had been was due to be there too, watching the planes. But first of all, he looked for a woman's face at the end of the pier. He ran towards her, and when he recognized the man who had trailed him since the camp, he knew there was no way out of time, and he knew that this haunted moment he had been granted to see as a child was the moment of his own death.
As the narrator says, this haunting moment he had been granted to see as a child was the moment of his own death. Now he is not there as a child, but a man, and not as a witness, but as a victim of the very men who carried out the experiments that sent him into the past and to his own death in the first place. How can that be? If he died, how could he live to save a future world? And if he lived, how could he go back to see himself die before he saved the world? Like Creton's paradox, la jetée forces us to oscillate between in possible, undecidable alternatives. And it does it vividly and powerfully. It's a mind-boggling film, literally. Just as Chronique d'un été explores the paradoxical nature of self-presentation in the face of a camera, a clearly timeless issue, La Jetée explores the paradoxical nature of time, lived time, where we rewrite the past in the present through memory. The paradox of a past that's never truly past and a present never truly free from the past is another clearly timeless paradox we're destined to live as part of what it means to live at all. Or to put it differently, what Roucher-Marin in Chronique d'un été and very clearly Marquer in La Jetée explore is less the immediate historical problems of 1960s France, as much as two of the many paradoxes that go to define the very nature of the human experience. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a great and successful conference.